It was a bright and sunny Saturday morning in Maple Grove. Maple Grove was a tiny neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. The houses were small and neat, with green lawns and flowers in the yards. Kids rode their bikes up and down the street, and old folks sat on their porches sipping lemonade. Nothing big or exciting ever happened here. It was quiet. Too quiet, some might say. But that was all about to change, and it started with one guy named Jake Miller. Jake was new in town. He moved into the little yellow house on Elm Street just a few weeks ago. He was a regular-looking dude. Not too tall, not too short, with brown hair and a big, friendly smile that made people feel good. He wore jeans and a t-shirt most days, and he liked to fix things. If your bike had a flat tire or your mailbox was wobbly, Jake was the guy to call. He carried a little toolbox with him sometimes, and he'd whistle a happy tune while he worked. Everyone liked him. Well, almost everyone. See, there was one person in Maple Grove who didn't like Jake at all. Her name was Karen Pritchard. Karen wasn't just any neighbor, she was the boss of the HOA. That stands for Homeowners Association, which is like a club that makes rules for the neighborhood. Karen loved rules more than anything. She loved them more than ice cream, more than sunny days, more than her fluffy cat named Mr. Whiskers. If your grass grew too tall, Karen would show up with a ruler to measure it. If your trash can stayed out past Tuesday, she'd leave a grumpy note on your door. She walked around with a clipboard and a pen, writing down every little thing she didn't like. And when Jake moved in, Karen decided she didn't like him. It all started because of a shade. Not a big, fancy shade, just a simple piece of blue cloth Jake hung up on his front porch. His porch faced the sun all day, and it got super hot. So one Saturday, Jake grabbed some rope and a big blue tarp from his garage. He tied it up over his porch to make some shade. It flapped a little in the wind, and Jake thought it looked pretty cool. He sat under it with a glass of water, smiling at how nice and shady it was now. The neighbors walking by waved at him. "Hey, Jake. Nice shade," they'd say. He'd wave back and say, "Thanks. Wanna sit for a bit?" Most people thought it was a good idea. But not Karen. Karen lived right across the street in a white house with pink curtains. She was sitting on her own porch that morning, sipping tea and watching the neighborhood like a hawk. When she saw Jake's blue shade go up, her eyes got narrow. She put her tea down, grabbed her clipboard, and stood up real fast. "What is that?" she muttered to herself. She didn't like it one bit. To Karen, that shade wasn't just a piece of cloth, it was trouble. Big trouble. She didn't know why yet, but she was sure it broke some rule. And Karen hated when people broke her rules. Now, here's the thing nobody in Maple Grove knew yet: Jake wasn't just some random guy who liked fixing stuff. He had a secret. A really big secret. It wasn't the kind of secret like "I ate the last cookie" or "I forgot to do my homework." No, this was a secret that could change everything. It was the kind of secret that made you go, "Whoa, no way," when you found out. And that little blue shade on his porch? It wasn't just there to keep the sun away. It was part of something much bigger, something that was going to turn Karen's perfect little world upside down. Let's rewind a bit and talk about Jake moving in. When he first got to Maple Grove, he pulled up in an old red truck. It was beat up and rusty, but it worked just fine. He didn't have a lot of stuff, just a few boxes, a chair, and that toolbox of his. The neighbors watched from their windows as he carried everything inside. "New guy seems nice," Mrs. Harper said to her husband. She lived next door and liked to bake cookies for new people. "I'll bring him some cookies tomorrow," she decided. Mr. Harper nodded. "He looks like he knows how to fix things. Maybe he can look at our leaky sink." Everyone was curious about Jake, but they didn't ask too many questions. He was friendly, and that was enough for them. But Karen? Oh, Karen had questions. Lots of them. The day Jake moved in, she stood on her porch with her arms crossed, staring at his truck. "Who is this guy?" she said to Mr. Whiskers, who was purring on her rocking chair. "He doesn't look like he belongs here." She didn't trust new people. New people meant new problems, and Karen didn't like problems. She liked everything to stay the same, neat, tidy, and full of rules. So when Jake waved at her and said, "Hi there. I'm Jake," she didn't wave back. She just nodded once, real stiff, and went inside. Jake didn't mind. He just kept unpacking. The next day, Mrs. Harper brought over her cookies. Jake was outside fixing a loose board on his porch steps. "Hi, Jake," she called, holding out a plate of chocolate chip cookies. "Welcome to Maple Grove." Jake wiped his hands on his jeans and took the plate with a big grin. "Wow, thanks. These look awesome. Want to sit for a minute?" Mrs. Harper sat on the steps with him, and they chatted about the neighborhood. She told him about the kids who played tag in the street and the big oak tree at the end of the road. She didn't mention Karen, but Jake already knew about her. He'd seen her watching him from her window, her eyes sharp like a cat hunting a mouse. A few days later, Jake met more neighbors. There was Tim, a guy who loved his loud motorcycle, and Sally, a girl who walked her tiny dog every morning. They all said hi to Jake, and he said hi back. He fixed Tim's mailbox when it fell over, and he helped Sally carry her groceries one day. Everyone started calling him Fix-It Jake because he was so good at helping out. But Karen didn't call him that. She called him Trouble. She didn't say it to his face, but she wrote it on her clipboard under his name, Jake Miller, Trouble. So when Jake put up that shade on Saturday, Karen was ready to pounce. She didn't care that it was just a piece of cloth. To her, it was a sign that Jake didn't follow rules. And if there was one thing Karen couldn't stand, it was people who didn't listen to her. She marched across the street, her flip-flops slapping the pavement, her clipboard tucked under her arm. Jake was sitting under his shade, reading a book, when she got there. He looked up and smiled. "Hey, Karen. Nice day, huh?" he said, all cheerful. Karen didn't smile back. "What is that?" she asked, pointing at the shade like it was a monster. Jake looked up at it, then back at her. "Oh, this. It's just a shade. Keeps the sun off my porch." He said it nice and easy, like it was no big deal. But to Karen, it was a big deal. "That's not allowed," she snapped. "It's against the rules." Jake tilted his head. "What rules?" he asked, still calm. Karen's face got red. "HOA rules. Regulation 47B says no shades like that. Take it down." Jake didn't argue. He just shrugged and said, "It's my porch, Karen. I like it." Then he went back to his book. Karen stood there, huffing and puffing like an angry dragon. She couldn't believe it. Who did this guy think he was? Didn't he know she was in charge? She turned around and stomped back to her house, already planning her next move. Jake watched her go, and if you looked close, you might have seen a tiny grin on his face. A grin that said, "Oh, you have no idea what's coming." See, Jake wasn't worried about Karen. He wasn't worried about her rules or her clipboard or her grumpy face. Why? Because he had that secret. A secret so big it made Karen's rules look like a silly game. What was it? Well, I'm not telling you yet. You'll have to keep reading to find out. But here's a hint, that blue shade wasn't just for keeping the sun away. It was hiding something. Something important. Something that was going to make Karen wish she'd never messed with Jake Miller. Back at her house, Karen sat down with her tea and her clipboard. She wrote down everything about the shade, how big it was, what color it was, how it flapped in the wind. She even drew a little picture of it, with an arrow pointing to Jake's house. "This isn't over," she said to Mr. Whiskers. The cat yawned and didn't care. But Karen cared. She cared a lot. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to start a fight she couldn't win. A fight that would show everyone in Maple Grove who Jake really was. The neighbors didn't know what was coming either. They saw the shade and thought, "Oh, cool, Jake's porch looks nice now." They didn't see Karen glaring at it from her window. They didn't hear her muttering about rules and trouble. And they didn't know that Jake was sitting under that shade, calm as can be, with a secret that was about to change everything. The sun was still shining, the kids were still playing, and Maple Grove still felt quiet. But not for long. So, what do you think Jake's secret could be? Is he a superhero? A spy? Maybe he's got a magic porch shade that does tricks. I'm not telling you yet, but I promise it's wild. Stick around, because the story is just getting started. Things are about to get crazy in Maple Grove, and Karen's in for the surprise of her life. Karen Pritchard wasn't just any lady. She was the kind of lady who loved rules more than anything in the world. Rules were her best friends. She didn't care about chocolate, or sunny days, or even her fluffy cat, Mr. Whiskers, as much as she cared about rules. If you lived in Maple Grove, you knew Karen's rules by heart, or else. If your grass grew half an inch too tall, she'd show up at your door with a ruler in her hand. Too long, she'd say, waving that ruler like a magic wand. If you left your bike on the lawn instead of in the garage, she'd knock and point at it with a frown. That's not where it goes, she'd snap. And if you dared to paint your mailbox a fun color like yellow or red, oh boy, you were in big trouble. Only white or black, she'd yell, writing your name on her clipboard. Karen's clipboard was her secret weapon. It was big and brown, and she carried it everywhere. She wrote down every little thing she saw, every rule someone broke, every tiny mistake. She'd walk up and down the streets of Maple Grove, her flip-flops slapping the sidewalk, her eyes sharp like a hawk looking for prey. The neighbors called her Rule Lady behind her back. Some kids even made up a song about her, Rule Lady, don't be late, she'll measure your grass with a grumpy face. They'd sing it and giggle, but they'd run inside if they saw her coming. Nobody wanted to mess with Karen. So, when Jake Miller hung that bright blue shade on his porch, it was like a bomb went off in Karen's brain. That shade wasn't fancy or big, it was just a piece of cloth tied up with rope. But to Karen, it was the worst thing she'd ever seen. It flapped in the breeze, making a little whooshing sound, and it blocked the hot sun from Jake's porch. Jake thought it was great. He sat under it with a glass of water, smiling at how cool and shady it was. The neighbors walking by liked it too. "Hey, Jake, cool shade," they'd say, giving him a thumbs up. Jake would wave back and say, "Thanks. It's nice, right?" Everyone agreed, everyone except Karen. Karen was on her porch that Saturday morning, sipping tea and watching the neighborhood like she always did. She had her clipboard next to her and Mr. Whiskers purring on the rocking chair. Everything was quiet and perfect, just how she liked it. Then she saw it, the blue shade. Her eyes got big, then small, then big again. She put her tea down so fast it almost spilled. "What is that?" she said out loud, even though nobody was there to answer. Mr. Whiskers didn't care, he just yawned and went back to sleep. But Karen cared. She cared a lot. That shade wasn't in her rules. It wasn't on her list of okay things. To her, it was like Jake had hung up a giant sign that said, "I don't care about Karen." She grabbed her clipboard and jumped up. Her flip-flops slapped loud as she marched across the street to Jake's house. Her face was already turning pink, and her hands were tied around that clipboard like she was ready to fight. Jake was sitting under his shade, reading a book about fixing cars. He looked up when he heard her coming. "Hey, Karen," he said, all friendly. "Nice day, huh?" He smiled, that big, easy smile of his, the one that made everyone else like him. But Karen didn't smile back. She didn't even say hi. She just pointed at the shade and yelled, "That's against Regulation 47B. Jake blinked. "Regulation what?" he asked, tilting his head. He didn't sound mad or scared, just curious. But Karen was mad enough for both of them. "Regulation 47B, she shouted again, like saying it louder would make him get it. "No shades like that on porches. It's in the HOA rules. Take it down, or I'll call the HOA board." Her voice was loud, and a few neighbors peeked out their windows to see what was going on. Karen's yelling was like a siren in quiet little Maple Grove. Jake didn't yell back. He didn't even stand up. He just shrugged his shoulders and said, "It's my porch, Karen. Keeps the sun out." His voice was calm, like he was talking about the weather. He didn't sound worried at all. That made Karen even madder. Her face went from pink to red, like a tomato ready to burst. "You think you're so smart, huh?" she said, pointing at him now instead of the shade. "We'll see about that." She turned around fast, her flip-flops slapping even louder, and stormed off back to her house. She was already pulling her phone out of her pocket, ready to call someone, anyone who would make Jake listen. Jake watched her go. He didn't move from his chair. He didn't take the shade down. He just sat there, still holding his book, and if you looked close, you might have seen a tiny grin on his face. It wasn't a mean grin or a loud one, it was quiet, like he knew something funny that nobody else did. Something about that grin made you wonder. What was Jake thinking? Did he really not care about Karen's rules? Or was there something else going on, something he wasn't telling anyone yet? Back at her house, Karen slammed her door shut. She threw her clipboard on the table and started pacing back and forth. Who does he think he is? She muttered. Mr. Whiskers looked up, annoyed that she was being so loud, then went back to sleep. Karen didn't notice. She was too busy being mad. She grabbed her phone and scrolled through her numbers. HOA board, she said to herself. I'll call them. They'll make him take it down. She stopped pacing and stared out her window at Jake's house. That blue shade was still there, flapping in the breeze like it was laughing at her. He's new, she said. He doesn't know how things work here. But he'll learn. Karen didn't like new people. New people didn't know her rules. They didn't know she was the boss. Jake was the newest guy in Maple Grove, and to Karen, that made him dangerous. She'd been watching him since he moved in with his rusty red truck and his little toolbox. He was too friendly, she thought. Too nice. People like that were up to something, she was sure of it. And now this shade. It was proof. Proof that Jake didn't respect her. Proof that he needed to be taught a lesson. She sat down and started writing on her clipboard. She wrote, Jake Miller, blue shade on porch. Against Regulation 47B. Must be removed. She underlined must 3 times, pressing so hard her pen almost tore the paper. Then she picked up her phone again and called Mrs. Linda, the secretary of the HOA. Linda, she said when the phone picked up. It's Karen. We've got a problem. The new guy, Jake, put up a shade on his porch. It's blue and ugly, and it's against the rules. Linda's voice was sleepy on the other end. A shade, she asked. What's wrong with a shade? Karen huffed. Everything. It's not allowed. We need a meeting. Linda sighed. Okay, Karen. I'll tell the board. But it's Saturday. Can it wait? Karen didn't like that answer. No, it can't wait, she snapped. He's breaking the rules right now. We have to do something. Linda mumbled something about talking later and hung up. Karen put the phone down and glared out her window again. Jake was still there, reading his book, acting like nothing was wrong. That made her madder than ever. Across the street, Jake turned a page in his book. He could feel Karen watching him. He knew she was mad. But he didn't look up. He didn't wave or say anything. He just kept reading, sipping his water, sitting under that shade. The neighbors who'd heard Karen yelling were whispering to each other now. What's wrong with the shade? Mrs. Harper asked her husband. I think it's nice, Mr. Harper said. Keeps the sun off him. Down the street, Tim, the motorcycle guy, laughed. Karen's losing it over a piece of cloth, he said to Sally, who was walking her dog. Sally giggled. She's gonna make a big fuss, isn't she? They all thought it was funny. But Karen didn't. Karen spent the rest of the day planning. She wrote more notes on her clipboard. She looked up Regulation 47B in her big HOA rulebook to make sure she was right. She always was. The rule said no unapproved structures on porches, and to her, that shade was a structure. It didn't matter that it was just cloth and rope. It didn't matter that it wasn't hurting anyone. To Karen, rules were rules, and Jake was breaking them. She wasn't going to let that slide. By lunchtime, she'd made a plan. Step 1, call the HOA board. Step 2, get them to send Jake a letter telling him to take the shade down. Step 3, if he didn't listen, call someone bigger like the city. She didn't know who yet, but she'd figure it out. Maybe the police. Yeah, the police could make him listen. She smiled at that thought. He'll see, she said to herself. He can't ignore me. Meanwhile, Jake finished his book. He stood up, stretched, and looked at the shade. Still looks good, he said out loud, even though nobody was there. Then he went inside to make a sandwich. He wasn't worried about Karen's yelling or her phone calls. He wasn't scared of her clipboard or her rules. Why? Because Jake had something up his sleeve. Something Karen didn't know about. Something that made her mad face and loud voice seem small and silly. What was it? Well, I'm not telling you yet. But here's a clue, Jake's calm grin wasn't just because he liked his shade. It was because he knew something big. Karen thought she was the boss of Maple Grove, but Jake had a trick or two that she didn't see coming. She could yell all she wanted, but Jake wasn't going to back down. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. The sun was still high in the sky, and Maple Grove was still quiet except for Karen's muttering. The shade flapped in the breeze, bright and blue, like a flag saying, "I'm here to stay." Karen watched it from her window, her hands clenched tight. She didn't know it yet, but she'd just started a fight she couldn't win. And Jake? He was ready for it? More ready than she could ever guess. The next day was Sunday, and the sun was shining bright over Maple Grove again. Karen Pritchard woke up early, like she always did. She put on her pink robe, fed Mr. Whiskers, and grabbed her clipboard. She had a mission. That blue shade on Jake Miller's porch was still there, flapping in the breeze, mocking her rules. She wasn't going to let it stay, not if she could help it. She gulped down her tea, slipped on her flip-flops, and marched across the street with a big, smug smile on her face. She was ready to win. Jake was already outside when she got there. He was leaning against his front door, sipping coffee from a red mug. He looked relaxed, like he didn't have a care in the world. The shade was above him, bright blue and happy, keeping the sun off his porch. Karen didn't say hi or wave. She just stopped in his yard, held up her clipboard, and pointed at the shade. "I measured it," she said, her voice loud and proud. "It's 2 feet wider than allowed. I'm reporting you." She pulled a little ruler out of her pocket and waved it around like it was proof. Then she started scribbling notes on her clipboard, her pen moving fast like she was solving a big crime. Jake didn't say anything. He didn't move from the door. He just stood there, sipping his coffee, watching her with that calm look he always had. His eyes followed her pen as it scratched across the paper, but he didn't look mad or scared. He didn't even look surprised. Karen kept writing shade too big. 2 feet over limit. Breaking Rule 47B. She underlined breaking twice, her smile getting bigger. "You're in trouble now," she said, looking up at him. "The HOA board will make you take it down. You'll see." She turned around and marched back to her house, her flip-flops slapping the ground loud and fast. She thought she'd won. She thought Jake would be scared. But Jake? He just took another sip of coffee and stayed quiet. The neighbors saw it all. Mrs. Harper was watering her flowers next door, and she peeked over her fence. "What's Karen up to now?" she whispered to herself. Down the street, Tim was polishing his motorcycle, and he chuckled. "She's really mad about that shade, huh?" he said to nobody. Sally was walking her tiny dog, and she stopped to watch Karen stomp away. "Poor Jake," she said, shaking her head. But Jake didn't look like he needed pity. He looked fine, too fine, maybe. That quiet way he stood there made you wonder. Was he really not worried? Or did he know something Karen didn't? Things got weirder that afternoon. Around lunchtime, a big white delivery truck rumbled down Elm Street. It stopped right in front of Jake's house. The driver hopped out, carrying a huge brown box bigger than a TV, maybe even bigger than Mr. Whiskers if you stacked 2 of him up. The driver set the box on Jake's porch with a thud, then drove off. Jake came outside, still calm as ever, and dragged the box inside. Karen saw it all from her window. She'd been sitting there since her big clipboard moment, keeping an eye on Jake. When that box showed up, her eyes got narrow. She didn't like surprises. Surprises meant trouble, and Jake was already trouble in her book. Karen leaned closer to her window, squinting at the box before Jake pulled it inside. "What's in there?" she muttered. She couldn't see any labels or words on it, just plain brown cardboard. That made her even madder. She didn't like not knowing things. She grabbed her clipboard again and wrote, "Big box delivered to Jake's porch." Suspicious. She tapped her pen on the table, thinking hard. Was it more shades? Was he planning something sneaky? She had to find out. So she marched back across the street, her flip-flops slapping even louder this time. Jake was just closing his door when she got there. He turned around and saw her coming. "Hey, Karen," he said, that friendly smile back on his face. "What's up?" Karen didn't smile. She pointed at the spot where the box had been. "What's in there?" she demanded, her voice sharp like a teacher catching a kid with candy. Jake tilted his head, like he was thinking about it. Then he winked just one quick wink and said, "You'll see." That was it? No big answer, no explanation, just you'll see. Then he went inside and shut the door, leaving Karen standing there with her mouth open. Karen didn't like that wink. She didn't like it one bit. You'll see, she said to herself, stomping back to her house. What does that mean? She sat down with her clipboard and wrote, Jake said you'll see. Very suspicious. She underlined very 3 times. That wink stuck in her head like a song she couldn't stop hearing. It made her feel like Jake was laughing at her, even though he didn't laugh out loud. She didn't know what was in the box, but she was sure it was bad. Maybe it was something to make his shade even bigger. Maybe it was something to break more rules. Whatever it was, she wasn't going to let it slide. That night, things got even stranger. The sun went down, and Maple Grove got quiet. The kids stopped riding their bikes, and the old folks went inside. Karen was still awake, though. She couldn't sleep not with that shade and that box on her mind. She sat by her window with a cup of tea, watching Jake's house. The street lights buzzed, and a little breeze made the trees rustle. Then she saw something. Jake came out onto his porch. It was dark, but the light from his house spilled out, and Karen could see him under the shade. He was tinkering with something small in his hands. Was it a camera? A light? A tool? She couldn't tell from across the street, but it looked funny. He moved his hands fast, like he was putting something together, and he kept looking around, like he didn't want anyone to see. Karen's heart beat faster. What's he doing? She whispered. She grabbed her binoculars, the ones she used to watch birds, and peeked through them. It was still too dark to see much, but she could tell Jake was busy. He bent down, fiddled with whatever it was, and then stood up. The shade flapped a little, hiding him for a second, and then he went back inside. Karen put the binoculars down and frowned. He's up to something, she said to Mr. Whiskers, who was asleep on the couch. Something sneaky. She didn't know what it was, but it made her mad. Really mad. She grabbed her phone off the table and dialed a number. This is Karen Pritchard, she snapped when someone answered. I need to report a disturbance right now. Her voice was loud, even though it was late. On the other end, a sleepy man said, what kind of disturbance, ma'am? Karen didn't waste time. It's my neighbor, Jake Miller. He's got a shade on his porch that's against the rules, and now he's doing something weird under it. I saw him. You need to send someone. The man sighed. It's just a shade, ma'am. Is he loud or something? Karen huffed. No, but it's suspicious. He got a big box today, and now he's tinkering. I don't trust him. The man mumbled something about checking it out and hung up. Karen put the phone down, feeling a little better. She'd done something. Now Jake would have to explain himself. Across the street, Jake turned off his porch light and went inside. He didn't know Karen had called anyone. He didn't know she'd seen him tinkering. But he wasn't worried. Why? Because Jake wasn't scared of Karen's rules or her phone calls. He was calm, too calm, maybe. That box? That tinkering? It was all part of something bigger. Something Karen didn't understand yet. Something that was going to make her wish she'd left him alone. The next morning, Karen was up early again. She checked her window first thing. Yep, the shade was still there. She smiled a little, thinking about her phone call. They'll come today, she said to herself. They'll make him stop. She made more tea and sat down with her clipboard, writing, called about disturbance. Jake acting strange. She felt like a detective in one of those shows she watched on TV. She was sure she was winning. But was she? Down the street, Mrs. Harper was watering her flowers again. She saw Jake come outside with his coffee and waved. Morning, Jake, she called. Morning, he called back, waving with that big smile. He didn't look like a guy who'd been tinkering in the dark. He didn't look like a guy who was worried about anything. Mrs. Harper didn't know about the box or Karen's call. She just thought Jake was nice. So did Tim, who roared by on his motorcycle and gave Jake a nod. So did Sally, who stopped to let her dog sniff Jake's yard. Love the shade, she said. Jake grinned. Thanks. Keeps it cool. Karen heard all this from her window, and it made her madder. Why did everyone like Jake? Why didn't they care about the rules? She tapped her pen on her clipboard, waiting for someone to show up and fix it. She didn't know what was in that box, but she was sure it was trouble. And that tinkering? It had to be something bad. A camera to spy on people? A light to annoy her? She didn't know, but she wasn't going to wait to find out. Days turned into more days, and Karen kept watching. The shade stayed up. Jake kept being calm. That box stayed a mystery, and the tinkering happened again one night. Karen saw it through her binoculars. She called again, too, but nobody came yet. She wrote more notes, still suspicious. Still breaking rules. She was getting madder and madder, but Jake? He just kept sipping his coffee, smiling at the neighbors, acting like everything was fine. And maybe it was fine for him. Because Jake wasn't just some guy with a shade. He had a secret, remember? A big one. That box, that tinkering, that calm grin, it was all leading somewhere. Somewhere Karen didn't expect. Somewhere that was going to turn her clipboard and her rules upside down. What was it? I'm not telling you yet. But it's getting closer. Stick around, because things are about to get wild in Maple Grove. Monday morning came fast in Maple Grove. The sun was up, the birds were singing, and the little neighborhood looked peaceful like always. But today wasn't a normal day. Something big was about to happen, and it all started when a police car rolled down Elm Street. Its lights weren't flashing, and its siren wasn't on, but it still made everyone stop and look. The car pulled up right in front of Jake Miller's house, the little yellow house with the bright blue shade on the porch. Tires crunched on the gravel, and the engine shut off. Two officers stepped out, their boots hitting the ground with a thud. Across the street, Karen Pritchard was ready. She'd been waiting for this moment all weekend. She stood on her lawn in her pink robe, her arms crossed tight, and a big grin spread across her face. She looked like she'd just won the lottery or maybe a prize for being the best rule keeper ever. Her clipboard was tucked under her arm, and her flip-flops were planted firm in the grass. Finally, she muttered to herself, her eyes locked on Jake's house. He's done for. She was sure of it. She'd called about that shade, that box, that sneaky tinkering. She'd told everyone, well, the HOA and the police, that Jake was trouble. And now the cops were here. In her mind, Jake was about to get in big, big trouble. The two officers walked up to Jake's porch. One was tall with a bushy mustache, and the other was shorter with a shiny badge that glinted in the sun. They looked serious, but not mad, just doing their job. The tall one knocked on Jake's door, 3 loud knocks that echoed down the quiet street. Karen leaned forward a little, her grin getting bigger. She could already picture it, Jake opening the door, the cops yelling at him, maybe even putting handcuffs on him and taking him away. That'll teach him, she whispered. No more shades. No more breaking my rules. The door creaked open, and there was Jake. He stepped out, still holding his red coffee mug, wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt. He didn't look scared or surprised. He didn't look like a guy who was about to get arrested. He just looked calm. That same calm he'd had all along. Morning, guys, he said, his voice easy and friendly. Wanna come in? The officers nodded, and they all went inside. The door shut behind them with a soft click. Karen's heart beat fast. This was it. She was sure of it. Any second now, those cops would drag Jake out, and she'd be the hero of Maple Grove. She waited. 1 minute passed. Then 2. Then 5. Karen tapped her foot on the grass, her arms still crossed. What's taking so long, she muttered. She expected shouting or banging or at least something loud to show Jake was in trouble. But it was quiet. Too quiet. The neighbors started peeking out now. Mrs. Harper opened her curtains next door, her watering can still in her hand. Tim rolled his motorcycle to the edge of his driveway to watch. Sally's tiny dog barked once, and she shushed it, staring at Jake's house. Everyone was curious. What was happening in there? Then plot twist, the door opened again. The two officers came back out, and they weren't mad. They weren't dragging Jake in handcuffs. They were laughing. The tall one with the mustache chuckled loud, shaking his head like he'd just heard a funny joke. The shorter one grinned, his badge bouncing as he laughed too. Jake followed them out, still holding his coffee, still calm as ever. Karen's grin froze on her face. What was going on? This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. The tall officer looked across the street and saw Karen standing there. He waved at her, all friendly like. "Ma'am," he called, "you called us about a shade." Karen's jaw dropped. Her mouth opened wide, like a fish gasping for air. She couldn't believe it. "Yes," she shouted back, uncrossing her arms and pointing at the blue shade flapping above Jake's porch. "It's illegal. Arrest him." Her voice was louder than the kids playing tag, louder than Tim's motorcycle. She was sure the cops would listen. She'd told them everything about the shade, the box, the tinkering. They had to arrest him. Right? But the officers didn't move toward Jake. They didn't pull out handcuffs or yell. The shorter one turned to Karen, still smiling a little, and said, "Ma'am, I don't think you get it." He paused, letting those words hang in the air. Karen blinked. "Get what?" she snapped, her face turning red again. She didn't like being confused. She liked being right. The officer glanced at Jake, then back at her. "Jake's one of us," he said. "He's an undercover cop." Karen's brain stopped working for a second. Her arms fell to her sides, and her clipboard slipped a little. "What?" she said, her voice small now, not loud anymore. The officer kept going. "That shade. It's hiding surveillance gear approved by the city. You just called 911 on a sting operation." He said it slow and clear, like he was explaining it to a kid. And that's when it hit her. Jake wasn't just some guy. He wasn't just the new neighbor with a shade and a toolbox. He was a cop, a secret cop working on something big. And she'd tried to get him in trouble for it. Karen's face went white. All the red drained out, and she looked like she'd seen a ghost. Her clipboard fell to the grass with a soft thump, but she didn't pick it up. She just stood there, staring at Jake and the officers. The tall one laughed again. "Pretty funny, huh?" he said to Jake. Jake grinned, not a big grin, just that quiet one he always had. "Yeah," he said, sipping his coffee. "Guess she didn't see that coming." The whole street heard it. Mrs. Harper gasped and dropped her watering can, water splashing on her shoes. "Jake's a cop," she whispered. Tim's jaw dropped too, and he almost tipped his motorcycle over. "No way," he said, loud enough for Sally to hear. Sally's dog barked again, and she picked it up, staring at Jake. "An undercover cop," she said. "That's so cool." The neighbors started talking all at once, their voices buzzing like bees. Jake. A cop? And Karen had no clue. Karen couldn't move. She couldn't talk. She just stood there, her flip-flops sinking into the grass, her brain spinning. She'd spent days yelling about that shade. She'd measured it with her ruler, written notes on her clipboard, called the HOA, called the police, all because she thought Jake was breaking rules. But he wasn't breaking rules. He was following bigger rules, secret rules she didn't know about. That shade wasn't just cloth. It was hiding cameras or microphones or something cool like that, all part of a big plan to catch bad guys. And she'd tried to stop it. The officers walked back to their car, still chuckling. "Good luck with the operation, Jake," the tall one said. "Thanks," Jake said, waving. "See you around." The shorter one looked at Karen one more time. "Next time, ma'am, maybe talk to your neighbor first," he said, not mean, just friendly. Then they got in their car and drove off, leaving dust swirling in the street. Jake stayed on his porch, leaning against the railing, sipping his coffee like it was any other day. But it wasn't any other day. It was the day Karen found out she'd been wrong, really, really wrong. The neighbors couldn't stop staring. Mrs. Harper ran inside to tell her husband. "Honey, Jake's a cop." "A secret cop," she yelled. Mr. Harper poked his head out. "What?" "Fix it, Jake." Tim rolled his motorcycle closer, grinning. "Dude, that's awesome. You catching bad guys?" he called to Jake. Jake just shrugged and said, "Something like that." Sally hugged her dog tight. "I knew he was nice," she said. Everyone was excited except Karen. Karen finally bent down and picked up her clipboard. Her hands shook a little. She looked at all her notes, shade too big. Suspicious box. Tinkering at night. It all seemed so silly now. She'd thought she was the smart one, the rule keeper, the boss of Maple Grove. But Jake was the smart one. He'd been quiet, calm, and sneaky, not sneaky in a bad way, but in a cool, cop way. She'd yelled at him, glared at him, called the police on him, and the whole time, he was doing something important. Something to keep the neighborhood safe. She looked across the street at Jake. He was still there, sipping his coffee, watching the neighbors buzz around. He didn't look mad at her. He didn't look like he wanted to yell back. He just looked normal. But now everyone knew he wasn't normal. He was a hero, a secret hero hiding under a blue shade. Karen's stomach twisted. She didn't like being wrong. She hated it. But there was no way out of this. Everyone had heard. Everyone knew. Kids started running out of their houses now, shouting, "Jake's a cop! Jake's a cop!" They rode their bikes closer, trying to peek at the shade. "Is there a camera in there?" one yelled. "Are you fighting robbers?" another asked. Jake laughed, a real laugh this time, not just a grin. "Maybe," he said. "But don't tell the bad guys, okay?" The kids giggled and nodded, like they were part of his secret now too. Karen turned and walked back to her house, her flip-flops quiet for once. She didn't stomp. She didn't yell. She just went inside and shut the door. Mr. Whiskers looked up from the couch, confused. "Don't ask," she muttered to him. She sat down and stared at her clipboard. All her rules, all her notes, they didn't matter now. Jake wasn't just some new guy breaking rules. He was an undercover cop, and that shade was part of his job. She'd called 911 on a sting operation, a real one. She felt small, smaller than she'd ever felt before. Outside, the street kept buzzing. The neighbors crowded around Jake's porch, asking questions. "How long have you been a cop?" Mrs. Harper asked. "What's the surveillance gear for?" Tim wanted to know. "Are there bad guys here?" Sally said, her dog yapping. Jake answered with little bits, not giving too much away. "Been a cop a while," he said. "The gear's just to watch stuff. And yeah, maybe some bad guys, but don't worry." He kept it simple, but it was enough to make everyone go, "Wow." The shade flapped in the breeze, looking prouder now, like it knew it was special. It wasn't just cloth anymore. It was a secret weapon, hiding Jake's cop tools. Karen had hated it, measured it, fought it, but she'd lost. And Jake? He'd won without even trying. He'd stayed calm the whole time, knowing the truth would come out. And now it had. The big reveal was here, and Maple Grove would never be the same. The police car didn't zoom off right away after the big reveal. The two officers, the tall one with the mustache and the shorter one with the shiny badge, stayed at Jake's house a little longer. They didn't hop back in their car and drive away like Karen thought they would. Nope. Instead, they plopped down on Jake's porch steps, right under that bright blue shade. Jake grabbed a couple of extra chairs from inside, simple wooden ones, and set them out. Then he sat down too, still holding his red coffee mug. The three of them started chatting, laughing like old pals who'd known each other forever. It was like a little porch party, and the neighbors couldn't stop watching. Karen stood on her lawn, frozen. Her clipboard was still on the grass where she'd dropped it, and her pink robe fluttered a little in the breeze. She wanted to disappear. She'd been so sure the cops were there to arrest Jake, to take him away in handcuffs for breaking her precious rules. But now they were sitting with him, talking and smiling like he was their best buddy. Her face felt hot, and her stomach twisted. She didn't know what to do. Everyone was looking, Mrs. Harper from her window, Tim from his driveway, Sally with her yappy dog. They'd all heard the truth. Jake was an undercover cop, and Karen had been wrong. Really, really wrong. The officers' voices carried across the street, and bits of their talk floated over to the neighbors. "So, Jake," the tall one said, wiping a laugh tear from his eye, "how long you been watching this place?" Jake leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee. "A few months," he said, calm as always. "Moved in to keep an eye on some shady stuff." The shorter officer nodded. "Smart move with the shade," he said. "Nobody'd guess it's hiding gear." Jake grinned, just that little grin he always had. "Yeah, works pretty good," he said. Karen's ears perked up at that. Shady stuff? Gear. She didn't know what they meant at first, but then it clicked. That big box, the one the delivery truck dropped off, it wasn't just some random thing. It was a hidden camera setup. Cameras and maybe microphones too, all sneaky and secret. And the shade? That blue cloth she'd hated so much. It wasn't just there to block the sun. It was a cover, a disguise to hide all that cop stuff so nobody would see it. Jake had been using it to watch Maple Grove, to catch bad guys, and she'd had no idea. The tall officer stretched his legs out. "What kind of shady stuff we talking about?" he asked, curious. Jake shrugged. "Some folks moving things they shouldn't," he said. "Stealing, maybe worse. Been quiet about it, but I've got eyes on 'em." The shorter officer chuckled. "And here we thought it was just a boring neighborhood." Jake laughed too, a real laugh this time. "Oh, it's boring till it's not," he said. The neighbors listening in went wide-eyed. Stealing? In Maple Grove? It sounded like a movie, and Jake was the star. Karen's head spun. She didn't suspect any shady stuff. She thought Maple Grove was perfect, full of rules and neat lawns and quiet streets. She'd been so busy measuring grass and yelling about shades that she hadn't noticed anything else. But Jake had. He'd moved in with his rusty truck and his toolbox, acting all friendly, and the whole time he was watching. Watching for bad guys. Watching to keep everyone safe. And she'd tried to stop him because of a silly shade. She took a step back toward her house, trying to slink away. Her flip-flops were quiet now, no more loud slapping. She wanted to hide inside, away from the laughing cops and the staring neighbors. She bent down to grab her clipboard, her hands shaky, and turned to go. But then Jake's voice stopped her. "Hey, Karen," he called from his porch. She froze again, her heart thumping. She didn't want to look at him, but she had to. She turned her head just a little, peeking over her shoulder. Jake was standing now, still holding his mug. The officers were watching too, grinning like they knew something funny was coming. "Next time," Jake said, his voice nice but firm, "just ask me about the rules. I know 'em better than you think." He didn't yell it. He didn't sound mad. He said it like he was giving her a tip, like a friend might. But it hit Karen hard. The neighbors heard it too, and they burst out laughing. Mrs. Harper giggled so much she had to sit down on her steps. Tim slapped his knee and hooted. "Oh, man, he got her," he said. Sally's dog barked, and she laughed too. "Good one, Jake," she yelled. Karen's face went red again, not mad red, but embarrassed red. She clutched her clipboard tight and hurried inside, slamming her door a little harder than she meant to. Mr. Whiskers jumped off the couch, startled, and stared at her. "Don't look at me like that," she muttered. She flopped into her chair and dropped the clipboard on the table. All her notes, all her rules, they felt so dumb now. Jake wasn't breaking rules. He was following bigger ones, cop ones. And he just told her, in front of everyone, that he knew more than she did. It stung. It stung a lot. Outside, the officers finally got up to leave. "Take care, Jake," the tall one said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Keep us posted on those shady folks." The shorter one nodded. "Yeah, and watch out for that lady with the clipboard," he added, laughing again. Jake waved as they climbed into their car. "Will do," he said. The engine started, and the police car rolled away, leaving Maple Grove quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet. It was a new quiet, full of whispers and excitement. The neighbors didn't go back inside right away. They stayed out, talking about Jake. "He's been a cop this whole time," Mrs. Harper said to her husband, who'd come outside to hear. "Fixing stuff and catching bad guys, wow." Mr. Harper scratched his head. "Guess that's why he's so good with that toolbox," he said. Tim rode his motorcycle over to Jake's yard. "Dude, you're awesome," he said. "Need help with those bad guys?" Jake grinned. "Maybe someday," he said. Sally ran up too, her dog bouncing in her arms. "You're like a superhero," she said. Jake just shrugged. "Nah, just doing my job," he said, but his eyes twinkled a little. By the end of the week, things had changed big time in Maple Grove. The HOA had a meeting. Karen didn't want to go, but she had to. She sat in the back, quiet for once, while Mrs. Linda, the secretary, stood up front. "We've got a new rule," Mrs. Linda said, holding up a paper. No more frivolous complaints. She looked right at Karen when she said frivolous, and a few people snickered. That means no calling about silly stuff like shades unless it's really a problem, Mrs. Linda went on. We've got better things to do. The room clapped, and Karen sank lower in her chair. She didn't argue. She didn't say a word. She just nodded, her face hot. The new rule stuck. People stopped getting grumpy notes about their grass or their mailboxes. Karen didn't march around with her clipboard anymore. She stayed inside most days, sipping tea and petting Mr. Whiskers. If she saw something she didn't like, a bike on a lawn or a loud kid, she didn't write it down. She didn't call anyone. She just let it go. The neighbors noticed. Karen's quiet now, Mrs. Harper said one day, watering her flowers. Guess she learned something, Mr. Harper said. Tim laughed. Yeah, don't mess with Jake. And Jake? He became the guy everyone wanted to talk to. He was still quiet, still cool, but now they knew he was secretly a hero. Kids rode their bikes by his house, waving and shouting, "Hi, Cop Jake." He'd wave back, that little grin on his face. Mrs. Harper baked him more cookies, chocolate chip, his favorite, and left them on his porch. For keeping us safe, she said. Tim offered to fix Jake's rusty truck, and Sally drew him a picture of a superhero with a blue cape that looked like his shade. You're the best, she told him. Jake kept doing his job, too. That shade stayed up, hiding his cameras, watching for those shady folks he'd talked about. Nobody knew who they were, not yet, but they trusted Jake to handle it. He'd sit under the shade with his coffee, reading his car-fixing book, looking like the same old Jake. But now everyone knew he was more. He was Fix-It Jake, Cop Jake, Hero Jake, all rolled into one. One day, Mrs. Harper saw Karen peeking out her window. She wasn't glaring or muttering, just looking. Mrs. Harper waved, and after a second, Karen waved back. It was small, but it was something. Maybe she's not so bad, Mrs. Harper said to her husband. Maybe, he said. But I bet she won't mess with Jake again. They both laughed. Maple Grove went back to being quiet, but it was a better quiet now. No more clipboard fights. No more silly rules. Just neighbors being neighbors and Jake keeping them safe, one shade at a time. Karen learned her lesson, and justice was served not with yelling or handcuffs, but with a little grin and a big truth. And that was just fine. Okay, friends, we've just been on a wild ride in Maple Grove, haven't we? That story about Jake and Karen and that blue shade, it was full of surprises. But now that it's over, let's sit back and think about it for a minute. There's something cool we can learn from all this, something that might make you look at people a little different next time you see them. So grab a snack, get comfy, and let's talk about it. Here's the thing, sometimes the person you think is breaking the rules isn't really breaking them at all. They might even be the one keeping things safe, like Jake. Think about it. Karen saw that shade on his porch and got so mad. She thought Jake was being sneaky or bad because it didn't fit her rules. She yelled and wrote stuff on her clipboard and called the police. Sure, she was right. But Jake? He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was an undercover cop, watching out for bad guys, keeping Maple Grove safe. That shade wasn't just a piece of cloth, it was hiding cameras and secret stuff to help him do his job. Karen didn't know that, but it's true. Sometimes the people who look like they're causing trouble are actually the heroes. And then there's Karen, the loudest complainer in the neighborhood. She loved rules more than anything. If your grass was too tall or your bike was in the wrong spot, she'd be there with her ruler and her grumpy face. She thought she knew everything. She thought she saw the whole picture. But she didn't. She missed the big stuff, like Jake being a cop. She was so busy shouting about little things that she didn't see what really mattered. The loudest complainers, the ones who act like they're always right, might just be missing the whole story. They might not see the good stuff happening right in front of them. So what does that mean for us? Well, next time you see something weird like a porch shade that doesn't look normal, or a quiet neighbor who keeps to themselves, maybe don't jump to a fight. Don't grab a ruler or a clipboard like Karen. Give them a smile instead. Say hi. Wave from across the street. You never know who they really are. That quiet kid in your class who doesn't talk much. Maybe they're super smart or really good at something cool. That neighbor who doesn't mow their lawn all the time. Maybe they're busy helping someone or working on a big secret like Jake. You don't know until you look closer, and yelling doesn't help you see. Let's think about Jake for a second. He was so calm the whole time. Karen yelled at him, measured his shade, called the cops, but he didn't get mad. He didn't shout back. He just sipped his coffee and smiled that little smile. Why? Because he knew the truth. He knew he wasn't breaking rules, he was following bigger ones. He didn't need to prove anything to Karen right away. He just waited, and the truth came out. That's pretty cool, right? It's like he had a superpower, not flying or super strength, but being patient and quiet. Maybe we can be like that too. Next time someone's mean or loud, maybe we can stay calm and wait. The truth usually shows up if you give it time. And Karen? She learned something big. She thought she was the boss of Maple Grove, but she found out she wasn't. She had to stop with her clipboard and her complaining because everyone saw she was wrong. It wasn't easy for her, she didn't like being wrong, but it made things better. The neighborhood got quieter, happier. People stopped worrying about silly rules and started being nice to each other. Karen messed up, but that mess up helped everybody in the end. Sometimes even the loud complainers can change, and that's a good thing too. So here's a fun idea: what if we all tried to be a little like Jake? Not the cop part unless you want to be a cop someday, which would be awesome, but the calm part. The part where he didn't fight back, just waited and smiled. What if, next time you see something you don't get, you ask a question instead of getting mad? Like, hey, why's that shade up, or what's that person doing? You might find out something cool. You might meet a hero. You might even make a new friend. Smiling and asking is way more fun than yelling and pointing, don't you think? Let's imagine you're walking home from school. You see a kid sitting on their porch, drawing in a notebook. They're quiet, and nobody talks to them much. Maybe you think they're weird, like Karen thought about Jake. But what if you wave instead? What if you say, "Hi, what are you drawing?" Maybe they're making a comic book about superheroes. Maybe they're really good at it. Maybe they've got a secret talent, and you'd never know unless you smiled first. That's what this story teaches us: don't judge too fast. Give people a chance. You might be surprised. Or picture this: your neighbor puts up a funny sign in their yard. It's big and bright, and you think, that's not normal. You could complain, like Karen did about the shade. You could say, take it down. But what if you knock on their door and ask, hey, what's that sign for? Maybe they're throwing a party for a sick friend. Maybe it's a joke to make people laugh. You won't know unless you try being nice first. That's the trick: being nice opens doors, and complaining just slams them shut. Jake's shade was a little thing that turned into a big thing. It looked silly to Karen, but it was important to him and to Maple Grove. It's like how little stuff in your life can be big too. A smile might seem small, but it can make someone's day. A wave might not feel like much, but it can start a friendship. You never know who's on your side, who's helping you out, until you look past the outside stuff. Jake was on everyone's side, even Karen's, and she didn't see it till the end. But we can see it now. We can be smarter than that. So what did you think of that twist, friends? Wasn't it wild when the cops said Jake was one of them? I bet you didn't see that coming, or did you? Tell me in the comments. Would you have guessed Jake's secret? Did you think he was a cop, or maybe something else like a superhero or a spy? I want to hear your ideas. And while you're at it, tell me about a time you were surprised by someone. Maybe a quiet kid turned out to be super cool, or a grumpy neighbor did something nice. Share your stories, I'll read them all. This whole adventure with Jake and Karen, it's got me thinking. People aren't always what they seem. The ones who look like trouble might be the ones saving the day. The loud ones might be the ones who need to listen more. And us? We can be the ones who figure it out with a smile and a little patience. Next time you're out there, walking by a porch or a yard, look around. Who's the Jake in your world? Who's the hero hiding in plain sight? Give him a wave. You might just find out. See you in the next story, friends. Keep being curious, keep being kind, and keep looking for the good stuff. You never know what's waiting behind the next shade. So, friends, we've talked a lot about Jake and Karen and that crazy shade. It's been a fun ride, right? But there's more we can think about, more cool stuff to chew on before we say goodbye to Maple Grove. Let's keep going and see what else we can learn from this wild story. Grab your juice box or your favorite toy, and let's dive back in. Think about this for a second. Jake didn't tell anyone his secret right away. He didn't run around shouting, "Hey, I'm a cop. Look at me." He stayed quiet. He fixed bikes and mailboxes and waved at people, acting like a regular guy. Why didn't he brag? Because he didn't need to. He knew what he was doing was important, and he let it show when the time was right. That's a big lesson for us. You don't always have to yell about how great you are. Sometimes being good at something like drawing, or helping, or even just being a good friend shines through without words. Jake's shade didn't scream "I'm special," but it was. Maybe you've got your own shade, something quiet but awesome about you. You don't have to show it off. Just let it be there, and people will notice when it matters. Now, let's flip it around and look at Karen again. She wasn't a bad person, not really. She just loved rules too much. She thought rules kept everything perfect, like a big puzzle with all the pieces in place. But when Jake's shade showed up, it messed up her puzzle, and she got mad. She didn't stop to think, "Hey, maybe there's more to this." She just grabbed her clipboard and started fighting. We've all been a little like Karen sometimes, haven't we? Maybe you got mad because a friend didn't follow the game rules right, or a sibling took your toy without asking. It's easy to get upset when things don't go your way. But Karen's big mistake was not asking questions. If she'd said, "Jake, why's that shade up?" she might have learned the truth sooner and saved herself a lot of embarrassment. That's a cool trick we can try, asking instead of arguing. Next time something bugs you, like your brother eating the last cookie, don't yell right away. Try saying, "Hey, why'd you take it?" Maybe he's hungry because he skipped lunch. Maybe he'll say sorry and share something else. Asking opens doors, like I said before. It's like a magic key that lets you see what's really going on. Karen didn't use that key, and she locked herself out of the truth. But we can be different. We can ask, listen, and maybe even laugh about it later, like the neighbors did when Jake's secret came out. Speaking of the neighbors, they were pretty awesome too, right? Mrs. Harper, Tim, Sally, they all liked Jake from the start. They didn't care about his shade or his rusty truck. They saw him helping, smiling, being nice, and that was enough. When the cops said he was one of them, the neighbors weren't mad, they didn't know. They were excited. They cheered and brought him cookies and drawings. That shows us something neat. Being kind makes people like you, even if they don't know everything about you. You don't have to be a secret cop to be a hero in someone's eyes. Just be nice, share a smile, help out a little like Jake did with his toolbox. Small stuff adds up, and it makes a big difference. Let's play a game in our heads. Pretend you're in Maple Grove. You're walking down Elm Street, and you see Jake on his porch, sipping coffee under that shade. What do you do? Do you wave and say hi? Do you ask about his secret cop job? Or do you just keep walking, like Karen did at first, thinking he's trouble? I'd wave, maybe even run up and say, "Hey, Jake, that shade's cool. Catch any bad guys yet?" He'd probably grin and say, "Maybe, because that's Jake." What would you do? Think about it, it's fun to imagine. Now picture Karen across the street, peeking out her window. She's not mad anymore, just quiet. What would you say to her? Maybe, "Hi, Karen. It's okay to be wrong sometimes." Or maybe you'd leave her alone and let her figure it out. She's not the villain here, she's just a lady who got mixed up. We all get mixed up sometimes. Like when you think you're right about a math answer, but the teacher shows you a different way. It's not fun to be wrong, but it's okay. Karen learned that, and we can too. Being wrong doesn't mean you're bad, it means you're growing. Here's another fun thought: what if you had a secret like Jake's? Not a cop secret, but something cool nobody knows. Maybe you're really good at singing, but you only sing in your room. Or maybe you can kick a soccer ball super far, but you don't play with the team yet. You don't have to tell everyone right away. You can keep it quiet, like Jake did, and let it come out when it's time. Imagine your friends' faces when they find out, big smiles, just like the neighbors when they heard about Jake. Secrets don't have to be sneaky, they can be fun surprises waiting to happen. And what about shades? Not just porch shades, but stuff that hides things in a good way. Like how a book cover hides an awesome story inside. Or how a plain box might have a great toy waiting to be opened. Jake's shade was like that. It looked boring to Karen, but it was hiding something amazing. Next time you see something plain like a cloudy day or a quiet park, think, what's hiding there? Maybe the clouds are saving up for a big rain to make puddles you can splash in. Maybe the park's waiting for you to find a cool bug or a secret spot. Everything's got a little magic if you look close. So, friends, what's the big takeaway here? It's simple: don't judge too fast. Give people a chance. Smile instead of frown. Ask instead of shout. Be patient like Jake, not loud like Karen. You might find a hero where you least expect it, like under a blue shade on a quiet porch. Life's full of surprises, and you're the one who gets to discover them. Isn't that exciting? Every day's a new story, and you're the star. Who knows what you'll find tomorrow? I really want to hear from you now. What did you think of that twist with Jake? Were you shocked when the cops said he was one of them? Did you guess it, or did it sneak up on you like a ninja? Tell me in the comments, I'm dying to know. And what about Jake's secret? Would you have figured it out? Maybe you thought he was a spy or a wizard instead of a cop. Share your guesses. Oh, and tell me this too: have you ever met someone who surprised you? Like a quiet kid who turned out to be funny, or a grumpy grown-up who did something nice? I bet you've got stories, and I'd love to hear 'em. Let's keep this going in our heads. Next time you're outside, look around. See a porch shade? Think of Jake. See a clipboard? Think of Karen. Smile at both, because they're part of this tale. And when you meet someone new, someone quiet or loud or just plain weird, give them a chance. Wave, say hi, be the friendly one. You might not catch bad guys like Jake, but you'll catch something better: friends, fun, and maybe a little magic. See you in the next story, pals. Keep your eyes open, your smiles ready, and your questions big. The world's full of Jakes and Karens, and you're the one who gets to figure them out. How cool is that? Catch you later. Stay awesome.